But if you don't debate me, you're a coward. Recently, I was invited by the ranking minority member on the Energy and Commerce Committee of Congress, Representative Joe Barton, to come to the United States and testify in front of that committee alongside Al Gore, who had been nominated by the Democrats as their witness, and I was going to be the star witness for the Republicans. For the first time in the history of Congress, the ruling party rejected the minority party's choice of witness. It's never happened before, apparently. They didn't want me to testify, me, a non-scientist, to testify against Al Gore. I wonder why not. Now, some lies from the UN's climate panel itself, because it's all very well poking fun at Al Gore, but he's now, frankly, just a bit of a joke. But now we get on to the serious business. This is the body which is supposed to be representing the true facts about the science to the world. But of course, it's not. It's just another vested interest lobby group. The first thing they did was, in 1995, Ken Overpeck talked to David Deming, a scientist who's expert in reconstructing past temperatures, who'd had a paper successfully published in Science for the first time. Overpeck congratulated him. Deming told the story 10 years later. And he said, we have to get rid of the medieval warm period. Now, Overpeck is one of the UN's scientists. We have to get rid of the medieval warm period. Not we have to check whether there was one, check how big it was, check where it happened and where it didn't. No, we have to get rid of it. And here is how they did it. There you will see the 1990 UN report's graph. I've colorized it a bit. I've spelt medieval correctly, but otherwise I've left it alone. And you will see the medieval warm period up there on the left, a kind of camel's hump. It's very clear. You can see the little ice age in the middle there, and then a tiny little pimple on the right, which is today's temperatures. Not exactly an exciting picture. But they were quite honest in the 1990 report. There was the medieval warm period. But then, 1995, Overpeck comes along and says, we have to get rid of the medieval warm period. Here is what they did by 2001. Same graph, but this time, no medieval bump. And look what has happened to temperature in the 20th century. A huge surge. How have they done that? Notice the small words, northern hemisphere temperatures. They left out the southern hemisphere, because if they had, they wouldn't have been able to exaggerate by 50% the warming of the 20th century, as they've done on this graph. So the double lie in this graph. One, no medieval warm period when everybody knows it exists and the science is clear on that. Two, they were able to exaggerate by 50% the warming of the 20th century. Here's how they did it. First of all, they said, right, we're going to use what are called proxy data sets. These are things like tree rings and sediments from lakes, and we're going to analyze them and see whether the width of the tree rings vary and so forth. We reconstruct temperatures before instruments were available to measure them. And what they did was every time they found a data set that gave them a hockey stick-shaped curve with a nice flat shank going back 1,000 years and then a huge uptick in the 20th century, they said to themselves, we'll give that 390 times as much weighting as we will give to those data sets which show the inconvenient truth that there wasn't this huge surge in the 20th century like the one at the bottom there. Both of those, incidentally, are tree ring data. 390 times as much weighting for the one that suited them as for the one that didn't. That was the first thing they did. Then they used an algorithm for processing all these data sets, a computer program for plotting the graph, which would draw hockey stick-shaped graphs even if you put random red noise into it. That's a kind of random data. Not even the real data, just random data. It would always produce that convenient shape for them which abolished the medieval warm period and exaggerated the warming of the 20th century. But that wasn't enough. Even when they tried both those techniques, the trouble was the medieval warm period kept on still showing up. So then what they did was, if you look at the faint line there, you can see that's what their data would have showed. They tried to remove the actual data for the medieval warm period from certain key data sets. They replaced it with estimates of their own that removed that inconvenient medieval warm period, and they didn't say in the paper that they published in Nature that that was what they'd done. Instead, they said they'd used the actual proxy data. So they actually lied in print. And it was two Canadian researchers who forced them to to publish a belated, lame corrigendum admitting what they had done. That is the length to which the UN has been going, actually to tamper with the data that is available to us. And now here is the truth about the medieval warm period. Here are just a few papers, 8 or 9 of them, out of the papers contributed over the last 20 years by more than 700 scientists from more than 400 institutions in more than 40 countries, establishing that the medieval warm period was real, was global, and was warmer than the present. That is the scientific consensus, if you do science by consensus, which the UN says it does. But on the question of the medieval warm period, the UN refuses to accept the scientific consensus. Instead, it uses made-up graphs, and it is still at it. This graph appeared a week ago in an update by the UN's climate panel, just in time for the Treaty of Copenhagen, about which I shall have a lot to say later. This graph is not taken from the literature, it's not taken from the data, it is taken from the most unreliable source on earth, Wikibloodypedia. And when this was spotted, they very quickly took it away again and substituted a different graph, which didn't show the disappearance of the medieval warm period. So they will lie and cheat, and even when they're caught out, they will continue to lie and cheat. And here's another one. I spotted this one. The day of publication of the UN's 2007 report, they published this graph, which had not been in any of the versions of the report which had been seen by the scientists. The final draft report by the scientists did not contain this graph or anything like it. This was inserted by the bureaucrats because I had leaked to the Sunday Times that the final draft report which we had seen had revised downwards the UN's upper estimate of sea level rise in this century from more than 3 feet to less than 2, with a best estimate of about 1.5 feet.